What I am talking about is a tribal economy. On remote islands in the Pacific Ocean, Stone Age farmers have figured out how to live within the environmental economy they have, and they have inhabited their small islands for thousands of years. You can find out how they've done it in Collapse by Dr. Diamond. A tribal economy depends on competent leaders and a well-informed public working together and doing whatever it takes to limit their environmental impact to whatever the environment can sustain. If everyone has the background education they need to be able to take over the chief's job, then the only reason he remains the chief is because the decisions he makes produce better results than the decisions anyone else could make. But if he chooses to abuse his power, he can easily be replaced. We're supposed to have that in the United States, but it depends on a well-informed public. It would also depend on a vote of no confidence, which is something that a lot of democratic societies have, but our Constitution doesn't allow. We do have the Second Amendment, which supposedly gives you the right to bear arms to defend yourself against corrupt politicians, but what good is that really going to do you? It's against the law to shoot politicians, which means if you try, the police and the military are going to try to stop you, which means you'll probably have to kill some of them to get to the politicians, even though they aren't the ones who are causing the problem. How many of your friends and your family and law enforcement and military personnel are you willing to sacrifice because a president was corrupt? So the Second Amendment effectively means nothing. This brings me to the human behavior part of biology the Founding Fathers didn't know. To this day, the majority of American voters still believe that human behavior is motivated by inherent goodness. If you're one of the 90% of Americans who are Christians, maybe you don't believe you are inherently good, but you do believe that the source of pure goodness is on your side. The school system reinforces that popular belief. We aren't taught the Pledge of Allegiance on the first day of kindergarten because the school board wanted to instill in us the attitude that we should think critically about our government. No, we're all taught to believe that America is right. And if America is right, then Americans must be inherently good. Because if Americans aren't inherently good, then America wouldn't automatically be right. You aren't taught to believe that all Americans are inherently good because some Americans are criminals. But you are taught to believe that all Americans combined acting the way they do must automatically be right because we're following the Constitution. If you read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, or On the Justice of Roosting Chickens by Ward Churchill, you'll see a selfish gene perspective on history. If you read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, or Crossing the Rubicon by Michael Ruppert, or Winter Soldier by Aaron Glantz and the Iraq Veterans Against the War, or watch America, Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo, you'll see a selfish gene perspective on current events. You'll see a whole bunch of evidence that shows how people with certain talents and skills that suit them well to our 18th century political and economic system have infiltrated the American political system and turned it against everyone else to make themselves ever more wealthy. If a U.S. president whose family has made a fortune in the oil business fills his entire cabinet with other people who have made fortunes in the oil business and the military-industrial complex. And then they decide to invade a country that has the world's second largest supply of oil. That ought to be your first clue that something other than inherent human goodness is motivating their behavior. And if people like that figured out how to control our government 2 years ago, what makes you believe they haven't figured out how to control it this year? The fact that we have a Democrat for president now? We're still fighting a war in the country that holds the world's second largest supply of oil, even though a majority of American citizens want an end to it. If you believe in inherent human goodness, you can look right at the evidence and still not understand it, because you'll believe that Americans couldn't possibly do something like that to other Americans. On the other hand, if you watch that documentary or read those books, understanding that organisms always adapt to their environments to maximize their genetic survival, and you understand that politicians and the people who pay for their elections are organisms who live in an environment where they get to write the laws the rest of us have to obey, suddenly there's nothing farcical about any of those documentaries. No, every single one of those documentaries becomes a strong scientific hypothesis that conforms to the law of parsimony by showing how the smallest number of interacting factors and no coincidences produced many widespread results. For all you science professors who purchased your insulation from objective reality so you wouldn't have to be the dead guys in that photo, let me tell you something about evil. The pioneers of global environmental science have been trying to warn everyone about the environmental crisis for 40 years. The threat of global famine and war is a political situation. Everyone who has ever served as president has known enough about politics to get themselves appointed president. If they know that much about politics, why do you believe they haven't heard of the limits to growth? Just because they aren't talking about it publicly doesn't prove they aren't making plans for it. That just proves they aren't inviting you or me to discuss their plans. But just because politicians know a lot about politics doesn't prove they know anything about environmental science. Most Americans I've met who aren't white already understand the idea of weaponized poverty. The fewer resources you have, the fewer choices you have in how to use your resources, because you need some of them just to keep you alive. To someone who understands a lot about politics and basically nothing about environmental science, the threat of global economic breakdown looks like the ultimate weapon for world domination. If you could use weaponized poverty against the entire human race at the same time, that would seem to be a very easy way to maximize your genetic survival by giving you way more decision-making power than anyone else had. The one big problem with that strategy is that a global environmental disaster would be uncontrollable. People could turn the environmental crisis into a weapon, but if they do, it will be a weapon that wields itself.